Through scandal, he held his head up high. He wasn't going to let the world shame him for who he was. And so, through scandal, he forged his way into being one of the well-known 1800s gay activists.
I got something between my legs that'll make a dead man come on. I got something between my legs that'll make a dead man come on. I'm gonna turn back my mattress and let you all my springs. I want you to find me, daddy, till the bell do ring. Oh, daddy, I want you to shade the drive.
Hello, my name is Summer, and this is Paying For It. Hi y'all, welcome back to episode 12. I am so very happy to have you here, and today we are going into part 2 of John Saul. So I will say, if you haven't already watched part 1, you should go back and watch that one so you can understand what's going on. But today we're going to get into his juicy story and hear why he became known for being an open and proud, and still today known as a gay activist and legend, really. So, before we get into it though today, I thought I'd just have a little chit chat with y'all. I don't have any current events because I didn't expect to do this into 2 parts. So we're just winging it. We're going off the cuff. But I'd like to say that I finally got my subscriptions back correct to where I wanted them and the price point I wanted them. So if you want to see more of me and the video versions, I highly suggest you go down and subscribe. But if that's not for you, that's okay. You can always leave a review and follow because it helps out a lot. And also you can find me on Twitter and TikTok at Paying For It Pod. I put clips up of the podcast up on both, and yeah, just see what I'm up to over there. Those will be linked down below along with the references I used for this episode. And yeah, so here we are, just getting back into it, I suppose. I don't really have much else to say, but I'm excited to be here. I'm excited to get into his story, and yeah, I know I will touch on last week's episode. I spent quite a bit of time on my intro topic and editing it. I feel very good about doing that, but I feel like I might not have talked quite as much as I wanted about the article, so I guess I could just finish my thoughts out here before we get into John. I promise it won't be as long as it was last time. But yeah, I was saying that I just feel as if we need to have some open and honest conversations with the women and men who work within the sex industry, the ones who do it open and proud, and what their thoughts are on how we can help with the epidemic going on for human trafficking and just the all-out violence that we have going on just like women and children. I do think it's interesting to see that through history we're always told that sex work is led to nothing but badness, and the women who are in it are victims and they need saving. And it's interesting to see history through current eyes because if we look at what is going on today, we have activism in sex work who are screaming for decriminalization and saying, listen to us, listen to what we have to say, and don't just make the decision for us. And how freaking on it, like, why can't we do that? Why can't we listen to women who make this their career and make some changes, not only to make their livelihood easier and safer, but also make it so that people aren't just getting snatched up off the streets? So, yeah, I do really want to keep my stories separate from that, but I also think that it's important to talk about all of the things going on within the world, because that's how you make changes. That's how you start to adjust to what is needed. And I just think if we start listening to the women and men who are actively in the world, that we can start also making some changes and making some real improvement on helping those who are not wanting to be in that world. That doesn't always mean that they won't end up in the world and still be in the world, but it should be on their own free accord. It should be of their free accord, not being forced, So I just think that we have so many people, so many educated people who live, work, and breathe this, who have real thoughts and ideas, but we don't want to. As a government, they just don't want to listen. They just don't want to. It almost at this point seems like they don't want to help the victims in this situation, because if they did, we would be having some real conversations. And I'm not saying it's black and white, but there's a pretty clear path that all the studies show. And we are ignoring that, and I don't understand why. So, yeah, I'm not going to shy away from the sad topics that are current events, and I'm not going to shy away from women who are killing it, because that's what this is. Not everyone thrives in every single job that they choose, but not everyone is a victim just because you don't agree with what they're doing. But we can do more for those that are being victimized when we stop pretending that people aren't also making this their career. Okay, I guess that's enough of that. Okay, let's move on. Let's get to John. So you know what time it is. Grab yourself a cocktail, a mocktail, a coffee, or whatever you fancy. Today, I have got a lovely cocktail. Actually, it kind of looks gross. I'm not going to lie. It's not a cocktail. It's a mocktail. I did lime, chamoy, bitters, and club soda with a tahini rim. But there's a bunch of like chamoy floaties. I hope it's not horrible. Let's take a little sip and let's cheers. Let's get back to John Saul or Jack Saul. Dublin Jack. Oh my God. That's all lime, baby. That is so tart. Okay. Tart as fuck. Let's get into this. Where were we? Ah, yes. We were just talking about how he was paid to write a book about Jack's life, and we knew it was Jack's life and not John's life because some of the things in his story don't align with his actual life. But that makes sense because he was paid to write an erotic novel, not his true story. And boy, did the world get an erotic novel they so desperately needed. And one that still today is highly regarded and, like I said, blush-worthy. But that was not the only time Jack was going to make history. Dublin Jack's erotic novel wasn't the only way he was going to make history and immortalize himself. Very soon, an old lover was going to have a re-entrance in his life. And it was not going to be in the sexy kind of way that most would hope for. All right, so to understand this scandal, you have to know the political climate in Ireland a little bit. Ireland was forcibly taken into the United Kingdom of Great Britain. So in their own country, the Irish citizens were treated like trash. It's also important to note that newspapers and journalism controlled the political climate and national support at this time. So since most of the popular and reputable newspapers were British ran, you can imagine that there was a huge bias. But it was daily that newspapers were feeding the public stories of Irish being savages, animals, and monsters, really painting them as just trash. And just like horrible beings, basically. But what wasn't being depicted in the newspapers, though, was just the mass amount of violence that was being depicted onto the Irish people by the British, as if British violence against the Irish people was normal, everyday, expected, and deserved, which is insane. But it's not something like we don't see nowadays, if we're being honest. This is something that goes on still today. Just not as in your face, I guess. I'm not going to say not as bad because it's still pretty bad. It's just that we try to cover up our bad, if that makes sense. In the 1830s was when the Irish did emancipate themselves away from the British rule. But still, they had an uphill battle ahead of them, mostly about getting what was theirs, their land rights back, just any sort of anything so that they weren't considered second-class citizens or, below the earth, pretty much. They were still considered second-class citizens even after being emancipated, because about this time is when John is born, and he's born into poverty like most Irish citizens were. This is a very intense political climate for everyone involved, and so it was in 1880 when the United Ireland newspaper that was ran by Irish nationals decided to try a little bit of a different tactic altogether to garner some movement in their battle. Nothing calls for action more than a big old sex scandal, baby. And boy, did we have one on our hands. So the United Ireland newspaper was started by Charles Stewart Parnell with a couple of friends, William O'Brien and Tim Healy, I think. This becomes Parnell's way to revitalize the nationalist cause and reach all of Ireland. So Charles Stewart was big in the fight to get rights back for the Irish people. Now, this is important because Parnell wasn't just a journalist. He was an Irish nationalist politician. And he was actually one of the guys who was kind of respected on both sides, but still he was Irish, so people looked down upon him. But when they got a hold of a very credible rumor that they did not hesitate to look into this rumor. Turns out it wasn't that hard to discover because they weren't even really trying to hide it. And they just thought their shit didn't stink, and what was people going to do about it, pretty much? Well, they didn't know what was about to come. The rumor had it that the secretary of the GPO, which is the General Post Office, was using the post office on Sackville Street to gain access to sexually available young men. Okay. So how does Jack become involved with this? Because isn't he in London? Yes, he is. But let me explain. Okay, so with just a little bit of digging, I mean, really, barely any digging, the British people who were in the GPO really just thought their shit does not stink. They were not trying to hide shit. They were like, whatever, we doing our thing, no one's going to do shit about it. They were able to find solid proof that this was in fact what was happening. They were using the GOP to run boys out of it. And I want to say boys and men, but they were young boys who were probably in the 16 to 18 range, who worked for the GOP or GPO, and also did rent boy on the side. And it not only was happening, they found out, but a lot of people were involved, and a lot of important and influential people were involved. So Hurley, the journalist, started alluding to certain Dublin castle administrators' naughty behavior. Never coming right out and saying it, but definitely alluding to the point no one could misunderstand what he was actually saying. This gossip hit the town hard and fast, let me tell you, because nothing's going to get people up in arms like a sex scandal, especially one about men being with men. And it wasn't long before other newspapers were also talking about it. They had to. So now when all the newspapers are kind of reporting on that, names start to leak. People start to name some names. This causes a bit of a lawsuit war to start to happen. The only thing the men involved who started getting named could do to attempt to save their reputation, even though at this point it's like the rumors already started, people are going to believe what they want to believe. But the only thing they could do in the public eye to save their reputation was to file civil lawsuits. If they were going to just try to let things die over, or try to stay out of the public eye and just let things go away, that's not how it happened. You couldn't just let things blow over, because that would pretty much be coming out and saying and admitting to this rumor. So even though it wasn't really a rumor, people they had some solid facts, they still had to do something, right, to save their reputation. So everyone starts suing everyone. When I tell you that, I'm telling you, that's what the 1800s were all about. It's someone would say something about you didn't like, so then they would sue you, and it became a huge public thing. And the everyone was bored, so everyone would go to these trials and watch it and get real hyped. So we're suing everyone. Okay. So everyone, like I said, starts suing everyone. However, the claims being made of several Crown employees committing sodomy couldn't just go ignored. Because it's important to remember, sodomy was illegal at this time, and it was very punishable. People took it very seriously. That was the worst thing you could do. And that's crazy, because whatever, just let people be themselves, okay? Because clearly, even though it's apparently immoral, it ain't stopping people from doing their thing. So anyways, So O'Brien hears that the Crown employees are attempting to sue them for being the ones who kind of stirred up the pot. However, he was not one to back down. And he felt as if in this case, the law might actually be on his side. So he hires a private detective. By the time the case goes to trial, which was a public trial and court hearings were all the rage back then, so people were pumped for this, the private investigator had gathered 22 witnesses whom all had slept with someone involved in the case. Well, do you have a guess on who one of those witnesses might be? Ding, ding, ding. Jack or John was tracked down and asked to be a Crown witness to their case because one of the 5 men being put on trial was none other than Martin Anarmor Kwan, a captain in the Royal Irish Army. And he was a son of a landowner, and that was super, super prestigious if you owned land back then. So he was just a high and mighty. This was a scandal. But he was better known to Jack as Lizzie, and if you remember from part 1, his past lover, the one that kind of introduced him to the life of rent boys and also to the life of a more upscale kind of way. Now, even though Jack was brought back to Ireland from London, his testimony never actually made trial. Jack later states in a different scandal that, don't worry, we will be getting there. His testimony wasn't used because when him and Martin had their love affair, it was quite a bit earlier than what was happening right now. But they still found him, and his name still got ran. His story still got ran. So even though it wasn't used within trial, his experience with Martin was definitely out in the open, definitely there. And so his testimony, though, for this trial would later be destroyed in the Irish Civil Wars. So we only know that what we can find in newspapers and the articles that were ran, but we also know that he did give a testimony. He just never was actually called to the stand because of how, I don't want to say dated, but his relationship with Martin didn't have anything to do with the GOP. And that was what was really important, is that these men of power were using the GOP and the boys who worked within the GOP for something that they should not have been using it for, you know? The 2 main men, though, that were being indicted in this trial were, Martin ends up getting lucky and kind of getting off without really getting any big backlash. But the backlash meaning going to jail and having to do hard labor, because that was part of your jail sentence if you were caught involved in sodomy. But the 2 main men involved in this that were being indicted in this trial was Gustavus Charles Cornwell, the secretary of the post office, and James Ellis French, detective director of the Royal Irish Constable. Now, French realized right away that if he continued to fight this and go to court, he would be found guilty. There was so much evidence. They had found too much damning evidence. So he dropped the lawsuit and retired quietly, and I'm sure fairly quickly, and went away to live the rest of his life out of the spotlight. Cornwell, however, did not, and pressed on, going to trial and tried to deny all the allegations. The trial lasted 5 days, and the jury took only an hour to find him guilty. He was then later acquitted due to not having enough evidence. You had to have at least 2 eyewitnesses to sodomy to actually be committed. They only had 1 eyewitness to Cornwell actually engaging in sodomy. At this time, anything leading up to sodomy was definitely frowned upon, but was not quite punishable. And so in this case, they only had 1 eyewitness to actually physically seeing him engaging in it, and a ton of men who said that they had, but no one had witnessed it. So he does get acquitted, which, to be honest, like, whatever, no one should be going to jail for like their sexual preferences. Ooh, and nothing wakes you up like straight ass lime. So this was also a big scandal because people have strong judgments of everything. So he does get acquitted. He gets released because at first he was in jail. He gets acquitted. And so, yeah, so through this, all the 22 witnesses kind of like were, of course, written about as if they were victims because they were young and being used and abused by these men of power, which, to be honest, some of them very well may have been just like trying to get a job within the post office and then getting wrapped up in this world that they were like not prepared for. Some may have fully known what they were getting into but didn't want to get in trouble themselves, so they went along with the private detective and kind of like played meek and mild. But anyways, this scandal was big and it was in the newspapers and people were like scandalized that such a thing could happen. But there was Jack, who just was like, it is what it is. I was with him. Like, we all know Lizzie and we all know what Lizzie's all about. But after everything kind of settles and people are acquitted and drop suits and stuff like that, the scandal, like normally, it went away. So after the Dublin Castle scandal, Jack goes back to London, and after living in various places, he eventually moves back in with Charles Hammond. This time, though, Charles Hammond was running a male brothel at 19 Cleveland Street in 1887. At this time, several male prostitutes were living there, but also they had telegraph boys working for them part-time as well. So he's got a system and a thing going. Jack moves back in and he's back to his day-to-day life. In 1889, Jack, still living at the male brothel, also gets a job working at the Drury Lane Theatre, which is still open today. It is unclear, though, if he played a role within the romantic comedy or if he was just a stagehand. His name does not appear on the speaking parts cast list. However, this is important to note because Jack worked in the theater with Alex Maywick Broadley, aka Broadley Parish, and he was acting as the financial and business manager of the theater at the time. He was acting as the financial and business manager of the theater's owner, Augustus Harris. This is important to note because it is alleged, according to history, it is alleged that they were also using the theater to run their business, and that's why Jack had a job there, was because he wasn't really a stagehand or a actor or anything like that. He was there applying his trade to those that were coming in and out of the theater, if you get what I mean. Now, this is going to go on to lead to the final scandal that Dublin Jack would be involved in. And this is his final act of immortalizing himself in the history and paving the way for the LGBTQ community. The Cleveland Street scandal. let's get into it. In 1889, Police Constable Luke Hanks was investigating a theft from a London Central Telegraph office. During his investigation, he stops 15-year-old telegraph boy named Charles Thompson Sincow. Charles Thompson Sincow. When searched, he is found with 14 shillings, which was a large sum of money to be found on him, as he was just a telegraph boy, and they weren't allowed to carry their own money. They did not get that much money for running letters back and forth. And so this officer is like, uh-oh, where'd you get this money? So this was definitely out of the ordinary for a telegraph boy to have this much money on him. It is equivalent to several weeks of his pay. So Hank brings him in for questioning, suspecting that he had something to do with this theft. It didn't, though, take long for Hank to get the confession from the boy, except it wasn't the confession he was expecting. Charles does admit that he got the money working as a male prostitute at a brothel located, you guessed it, at 19 Cleveland Street, a brothel that was ran by Charles Hammond. Not because he stole it. Then all thoughts of this theft go, because now they have a way bigger issue. According to Sincow, he was introduced to Charles Hammond through 18-year-old Henry Newlove, who was the General Post Office clerk, the GPO of London. What was going on in these GOPs, or whatever? I think I called them GPOs. They're definitely GOPs. I mean, Jesus, it's so, if you look throughout history, there are so many GOPs just having this scandalous things going on. Sincow didn't start there, though. He kept telling his tale, implicating two other 17-year-old telegraph boys who also worked for Hammond. Hank does the good cop thing and goes and gets statements from the two boys, George Alma Wright and Charles Ernest Thickerbroom. These names. So with all three statements, he was able to get a confession from Henry Newlove, the GOP clerk, who was recruiting boys for Hammond. With the three statements and confession from Newlove, Hank took his investigation to his superiors. The case then was handed over to Detective Inspector Frederick Albaline. Albaline first move was to obtain a warrant to be served on Charles and his 19 Cleveland Street brothel. The warrant was served on July 6th with a warrant to also arrest Charles Hammond and Henry Newlove. This was all happening because they were in violation of the Section 11 of the Criminal Law Amendment of Act of 1885. This act made all homosexual acts between men illegal. The clause provided for a term of imprisonment not exceeding 2 years with or without hard labor for any man found guilty of gross indecency with another male. What they actually considered or defined as gross indecency was pretty unclear, but it was widely interpreted as any male homosexual behavior short of actual sodomy, which carried a much more serious charge and it was a total separate crime. This act came pretty much in the direct results of the Dublin Street scandal, is that they felt like those men who clearly were being naughty got away with it because they weren't able to have eyewitnesses to sodomy. So that's why this is such a big deal, is because not only was Jack involved in that Dublin street scandal, he's now involved in another sex scandal. However, upon arriving to the 19 Cleveland Street, it is found completely empty and locked up. Hammond, the detective, though, was able to track down Newlove at his mother's house, and he was arrested. Between the time he gave his statement to Hanks the first time and being arrested, he was able to warn Hammond that the others within the house that shit was going down and that they better get out, pretty much. Newlove, though, on the way to the police station, started spilling all the beans, naming everyone and anyone he could remember that may have come through the brothel to purchase services. Abeline realized he had a much more of a problem on his hand than he originally thought, because the names Newlove was spraying, they weren't just nobodies that they could just go out and arrest and ruin their reputation and be done with it. These were influential clientele. These were in big, important names. So let's get into some of the notable clients of Newlove's list. Henry Fitzroy, Earl of Euston, was one of the main names to be named. So once they started pulling the strings on this scandal, it led to more leads, which led to more boys who had stories to tell of working within this brothel. Eventually, that leads them to issuing an arrest warrant for George Beck, who had worked for the telegraph office but had been fired due to improper conduct with the youth. So, we see that where that it went. Beck leads them to a man named Algon. Upon interviewing allies, that he admits that he received money from Somerset. Now, Somerset was Lord Arthur Somerset. He was the head of the Prince of Wales stable. So he was the stableman. So he was highly regarded and part of the royal family's inner circle. So this was a big thing here, okay? So on September 11th, Newlove and Beck were put on trial. Their defense, though, was completely covered by Somerset himself, and he sent his own solicitor, which is his lawyer, Arthur Newton, to defend these boys, which already to me says, oh, you got something to hide. They both plead guilty on the 18th of September, and they got a very, very light sentence of 4 and 9 months. Meanwhile, Hammond escaped to France, but then he immediately got expelled by the French authorities after they got a lot of pushback from the British. And because they wanted none of that heat, they were like, you gotta go. From there, though, he moved to Belgium, where he was eventually able to immigrate to the U.S. The case against Hammond was quietly dropped, interesting enough. So now Lord Arthur Somerset had left London, kind of like no care in the world, when the case broke against him and the others. He just left. He went back to Bad Homburg, where the Prince of Wales was on vacation for the summer. He did, however, return to London in late September to attend a horse sale. He, though, dips pretty fast because he got word that he was in danger of being arrested. Lord Arthur returns again on September 30th because he got word that his grandmother, the Duchess of Beaufort, Beaufort was passing. So he gets word his grandma is close to passing away, and he returns to London. A few days later, he has to attend her funeral, and while there, he kind of gets word gets out that he has returned to London and he might be here for a little bit. So the detective and police kind of go into action because they want to arrest him, because this is one of the names that is big and important and out there, but not as scandalous as some names that may have been involved that we will find out later about. So they're willing to take the chance to try to bring some charges against the Lord's stableman. So James Monroe, the police commissioner, pressed to take action while Somerset was still there. He wanted him detained. However, the Lord of Halsbury blocked any action that may have been brought against him. He was like, no way are you doing this. The family needs to be left alone. He's dealing with a loss. So Somerset, so a lot of rumors were spreading about Somerset's involvement in the Cleveland Street brothel. So on October 19th, Somerset dips out back to France. He stays in London doing his thing for a while, but then a lot of rumors start like kind of getting brought up. So it starts spreading that Somerset was involved in the 19th Cleveland Street scandal, and so the detectives decide that they don't care anymore. They want to bring charges against them. But Somerset gets word, or he just knows that it's time for him to leave. So he flees again, nearly missing an arrest. It is later said and accused that Lord Salisbury may have tipped Lord Somerset off that his arrest was imminent. Now, initially, this story barely got any coverage, and that meant that it would just kind of fade away from history. And that was until Everest Park, the editor of a very obscure, politically radical newspaper, politically radical weekly, the North Post, got wind of this story. One of his reporters brought him the story of Newlove's conviction, and with such a light sentence to the charges being brought, it made him curious why specifically they would just be light on him, because he openly admitted to everything and how offensive the crime was for that time. And normally everyone got the full extent of the sentence, the 2 years with hard or no hard labor. So he's like, I think I'm smelling a cover-up. So with some digging, he realized that there was way more to the story than originally thought. And to him, he started uncovering the cover-up. So he did some digging, and it didn't take long to find out that the boys, Newlove and the other boy, had named very prominent aristocrats within the brothel who had visited the brothel. And they couldn't have any of that. So they made these things go away really fast. Hence why there was barely any coverage. So on September 28th, he ran a story hinting at the involvement of aristocrats, but not ever giving any real specifics, hoping that that would do what it needed to do, get the ball rolling, get people into the juicy gossip and wanting more, right? And when that didn't quite work the way he wanted to get everyone's attention he needed to, he then runs a follow-up story dropping a legitimate name. He alleged that Henry Fitzroy, the Earl of Houston was a customer on 19th Cleveland Street brothel, going on to say that Fitzroy was able to escape any charges and was allowed to flee to Peru in an attempt to cover up the bigger names that were believed to be returning customers to said brothel. Although the article never stated the names directly, it was heavily believed, rumored, and alleged to be a member of the royal family, specifically the Prince of Wales, Prince Albert Victor. And let me tell you, the pictures that we exist of Prince Albert Victor, he's just so adorable. He looks so, like he would be a fun person to be around. Prince Albert Victor, known as Eddie, was well-traveled as he had traveled the world extensively as a naval cadet and served in the British Army. However, because of the fact that he was royalty, he never actually served active duty, but he was well traveled. When the article ran with Fitzroy's name, though, he in fact was not in Peru, but still in England. When he read the article, immediately he filed a case against Park for libel. This was because this kind of scandal would ruin you. Like I said, you needed to take action fast and prove that this never happened. So fast and swiftly was the way to go, to show the world and get the public's opinion immediately on your side. Being found guilty in the court was one thing, but being found guilty in the public eye, you could never recover from that, especially if you were a prominent figure. It would ruin you. So this trial begins. So Fitzroy, during his trial, claims that he only been to 19 Cleveland Street once, but left immediately. His story goes like this. One day, he was walking along Piccadilly and Trout Street when someone handed him a business card that read, Posey Pileski's C. Hammond, 19 Cleveland Street. Now, I know I said Posey's Pileski's, probably wrong, but a Posey's Pileski's was your historical striptease or even burlesque show. The model would pose in nude or semi-nude picture-like stances, and they would have like theatrical lighting throughout the duration of the display. And the people modeling or shown never spoke or moved. Okay, so this guy thinks he's going to see a little naughty strip show. Fitzroy testified that he in fact gone to the house believing that it was a Posey Plastiques. I know I'm saying that wrong. To see nude females. He paid the entrance fee, and upon entering, he was appalled to discover the improper nature of the place, and of course, he left right away. The defense, though, however, called several witnesses to the stand to testify that they had in fact seen him within the house, not once, but on multiple occasions. So they, however, all kind of contradicted themselves, each other, and couldn't really describe Fitzroy correctly, so it wasn't looking great for the defense. And that was until the defense called their final witness, John Saul, who they already knew had been involved in another immoral sex scandal. When being called to the stand, most of the witnesses acted embarrassed, ashamed, or as if they were a victim to this whole thing. This was a huge deal back then to them. To be named publicly in a sodomy trial, they would face backlash, especially being just poor boys and like nowhere to escape. So they had to kind of play the role that was given to them as a victim. Jack Saul, though, well, he entered the courtroom with his head held high and got on the stand and delivered his testimony with no shame whatsoever. He delivered his testimony brazen and almost cheekily. Saul admitted that he earned his way of living by leading an immoral life and practicing criminality, because remember, sodomy was against the law. So he was admitting it. He was like, yeah, I did that shit. He went into detail of his several sexual encounters with Fitzroy at the brothel. He, on stand, was reported to be a real character on the stand and real just proud of himself almost. Essentially, he owned his reputation and his way of life, not really letting those around him make him look down upon himself. He saw himself as a professional prostitute. Didn't like the narrative that was trying to be pushed on him and his fellow co-workers who were just being exploited, according to the judge in trial. The way he delivered his testimony shocked the courtroom into silence, and he was considered sharp, witty, and defiant, not playing the role that was given to him. At one point during his questioning, he had the entire courtroom gagged when he stated, he was asked by the judge, and were you hunted out by the police? No, they never interfered. They have always been kind to me. Judge, do you mean they have deliberately shut their eyes to the infamous practices? John, they have had to shut their eyes to more than just me. In his summary, the judge asked the jury, which just shocked the shit out of this whole courtroom, because he was saying, listen, you guys are blind to the fact that the cops turn their eyes to everything that's going on. The only time they want to do something about it is when it blows up into a story, because then they have to. So they were like, excuse me, what? How dare you, pretty much. And he was like, yeah, you know it, we know it. You know it, I know it. So please, come on, don't play dumb. Like, he just didn't want to he didn't want to play dumb. He didn't want the judge to play dumb. He didn't want the court to play dumb. Like, this is all going on under your guys' nose. Everyone knows about it. Everyone sees it and is okay with it until they can't be okay with it. But in his summary, the judge asked the jury to assess whether they could possibly accept the word of a loathsome object against the Lord Easton himself. A loathsome object. In court, he referred to a person as an object. With this, the fact that the defense for the trial didn't call New Love or Vecht, the two boys who had been sentenced in the first trial, regarding this. They also couldn't produce enough evidence that Fitzroy left and fled the country to Peru. Due to this, on January 16th, 1890, the judge found Park guilty, and he sentenced him to 12 months in prison, which was kind of wild. Now, some historians consider that Fitzroy was telling the truth and that he had only visited once, leaving when he found out the place was immoral, sinful. That his name was just thrown into the mix along with Prince of Wales to help the defense's case in the earlier trials. Some historians feel like there is no evidence to show either men visited the brothel, because the testimony of all the other boys doesn't count as evidence. They're loathsome objects, of course. However, some historians disagree and say that Fitzroy was guilty and in fact visited the brothel many times, as John and the other boys testified. Along with Prince of Wales, especially Fitzroy, though, they felt he was a huge part of the underworld of the male sex trade world. They also say that he was so involved that he was often extorted by the notorious blackmailer Robert Clibborn. So they're saying that this guy was like so involved that he was quite often blackmailed and extorted. But the drama doesn't end there, because as you are starting to see throughout this, that they took sodomy charges incredibly seriously. So another trial begins on December 16th, this time against Arthur Newton. This was Somerset's solicitor, which, just as a reminder, was the boys' lawyer that Somerset paid for the very original trial, New Love and Beck, that got the light sentence. Apparently, he was being accused of obstruction of justice. Allegedly, he had conspired to prevent Hammond and the boys from testifying at all in the trials. He apparently allegedly offered and gave them passes and money to go abroad to get the fuck out before the trial could ever become a thing. This trial, however, was pleaded out, as Newton pleaded guilty to one of the 6 charges that were being brought against him. The defense chose to not present the remaining evidence for the 5. The charge he pled guilty to, stating that he did in fact help Hammond flee merely to protect his clients from the blackmail. Newton was sentenced to 6 months or 6 weeks in prison, which was considered to be extremely harsh sentence for the time. In fact, 250 law firms signed a petition protesting his sentence. With all the trials and the public outrage that could be going on in the city, had Parliament investigating into Park's claims, even though he was found guilty, that this was a cover-up. Particularly Henry Laboucherie, who was convinced that this scandal went further up the government than most assumed. He claimed that he thought it was a highly unlikely that Prince Albert Victor was in any way involved, but he still accused the government of conspiracy to prevent the course of justice. He also stated that Prime Minister Lord Salisbury and other officials came together to hamper the investigation, allowing Somerset and Hammond to escape because they knew too much. He was so upset with this and the fact that he was also a raging homophobe. He went on to campaign successfully, unfortunately, to the Gross Indecency Amendment to the Criminal Law Act, which just would allow the court to try you for any evidence of being involved in immoral sin with another man. Which is, oh my gosh, get over yourself. Eventually, the scandal did fade into the background and then eventually into history altogether. But for this time period, it was a huge deal. Whether or not Prince Albert Victor actually participated in any of the activities at the brothel is really unclear and will probably always remain a mystery to history. Though for months, he and his family did get harassing letters due to just some rumors that he may be a part of it, which is sad if he wasn't, and it's sad if he was too. To be honest, it's sad in general to get harassed just because of your sexual orientation. Some historians say a lot went on behind the scenes to cover up his involvement by the government, because that would be worse than anything. However, other historians say that, again, there is absolutely no evidence to suggest he did participate, and that it was only a scheme from Hammond and the boys to get out of trouble, and that they were just using him as a means to escape. In my opinion, I can't say either way, to be honest. It seems weird that Hammond and the boys would just pick his name out of thin air to accuse if he was not somehow involved, right? But then again, maybe they knew they needed big names to try and get out of this big trouble that they were in. It could also be said that it's semi-strange that the Prince of Wales' stable hand, Somerset, was named in the scandal along with his son, Prince of Albert. Again, this is all speculation and could just be a rumor, but how often do we see in history high important people, and this was someone in the royal family, having a scandal being covered up by the government? I don't think it's that far off to assume that Somerset may have been there, and maybe he did participate, but maybe he was there with the Prince of Wales. I'm just saying. What I can say for certain is that it did cement John Saul's name in history more than ever. His testimony in the matter he presented did really shock the courtroom, because he was not ashamed nor willing to let anyone judge him for his choices. And that was just so uncommon back then. Despite Saul's confession on the witness stand and the way he showed no remorse for being a loathsome object, it was a surprising turn of events that the Attorney General still declined to prosecute him or any of the boys that came out to testify. The reason for this is still unknown, but does have you questioning why. Given how open and honest Saul was on the witness stand, could it be because Saul did also, in fact, name royal family members? And they just didn't want to take him to trial because of he wasn't afraid to tell it how it was? One may never know. The Euston libel trial was Saul's last appearance in the press, but boy did he make his mark, right? Because now we're still talking about him. Following the trials, his remaining years he goes on to become a servant to a small family-run hotel. Eventually, though, he does return to Dublin to be with his family because in the last trial, he had admitted to being pretty sick and in and out of the hospital due to being diagnosed with tuberculosis, which was the killer back then. In 1901, he is registered as a butler, and it seems that is where he stays until 1904, when his younger brother, James, has to admit him to Our Lady's Hospice, Harold's Cross. It was there that he would go to pass on at the age of 46 due to his fight to tuberculosis. He was then buried in Glasnevin Cemetery in an unmarked grave, sadly. Bringing an end to a historically prominent figure in a way that we would never have expected. Still talking about his wild escapades today. A lot of historians and stories talk about Dublin Jack, and though they are amazed and curious about his life, they still paint him as a victim. However, out of respect for John and Jack, I think it's a bit of a shit way to treat him. He himself didn't ever seem to believe himself as a victim, even growing up in the slums of the 1800 Ireland. While he had a career in prostitution, he was able to not only provide for his family, but also live a life he would never have the chance to do within his class. Travel, meet people, go to parties, and dress in finer clothing. Had he not made the choice to provide a service that seemed to be being bought quite often. I'm so glad we have some trace of Dublin Jack's story and John Saul's life so we can carry them into the light, help educate and learn from our past judgmental days. Also, what a role he still now plays in the history of the LGBTQ community. Just because your sex life works for you doesn't mean it will work for everyone, and just because your sex life may look differently than the quote-unquote norm doesn't mean it's wrong. We can see that in the attempted buried past of our vice, and we're so lucky to have the stories of people like John, because he shows throughout our history that no matter how much we try to pretend it's immoral, that it isn't, and people should have the right to honest, open, and sane, safe, and consensual sex whether it's with a man on man, a woman on woman, or whatever you fancy. Let people be people. And with that, I hope you enjoyed this two-parter on John Saul. I know that Dublin Jack story is a little chaotic because it's so far in history and we don't have a lot of his life is lost to the historical archives, but he still has an important story to tell that is relevant to today. Although he didn't get the respect he deserved at his time, I think he would be happy like hell yeah to the legacy. I think he'd be happy like hell fucking yeah to the legacy that he left behind, all because he was a rent boy and proud of it. As you should be, John, as you should be. All right, well, I hope that you all enjoy the rest of your evening and weekend, and until next time, make sure if you're enjoying to like, leave a review, and follow. And if you're vibing with me and my take on spicy history, I highly suggest you subscribe so you can see the tales being brought to you in a whole new way. If you're not quite ready to commit like that, that's cool too. Make sure you check out my TikTok and Twitter. They'll be linked down below. And yeah, with that, goodbye.
I got something between my legs that'll make a dead man come. Oh, that. I got something between my legs that'll make a dead man come. Oh, that. I'm gonna turn back my mattress and let you all my springs. I want you to find me, daddy, till the bell do ring. Oh, daddy, want you to shave